Everything in this bizarre play is worth talking about, including the name. The very title character, who never actually shows up, is most often referred to by American audiences as Godot. Audiences and critics in the UK, however, often say Goddo, emphasizing the god, as if God is the very figure they're waiting for. Samuel Beckett, who lived in France and spoke fluent French, called him Godot. In French, the emphasis is on the last syllable. However you say the name, it's impossible to forget the legendary absurd play. In the introduction of the play Waiting for Godot, two shabby men who seem to be old friends, Estragon and Vladimir, meet on the side of a country road near a leafless tree. They consider repenting, though they don't know what for. Getting bored, they consider leaving, but Vladimir says they are waiting for Godot. They have asked him for something, though they aren't sure what, and they are waiting for a response. They even consider hanging themselves as a diversion to pass the time. In the rising action, Vladimir and Estragon hear a terrible cry as the boisterous Pazzo stops to eat and talk to the two men as he roughly orders around and abuses Lucky, his subservient slave whom he keeps on a rope. Lucky is unresponsive except when following Pazzo's orders. Pazzo commands Lucky, dance, and think. After his silly dance, Lucky's thinking produces a jumbled speech that verges on profound meaning until it becomes increasingly unhinged in his passionate delivery, until the others angrily attack him and make him stop. Lucky and Pazzo soon leave, and a boy arrives with a message from Godot. He will not come this evening, but surely tomorrow. It seems the two friends have also heard this message before, although the boy claims not to have come yesterday. They ask the boy to tell Godot he has seen them. The next day, Vladimir and Estragon return. The tree now has a few leaves on it. Estragon suggests they part ways, but Vladimir doesn't want to, reminding Estragon of their encounter with Pazzo and Lucky yesterday, which Estragon only vaguely recalls. The men debate the value of thought, ultimately deciding it has little worth, agitatedly, confusingly arguing and continuing their random conversations and antics to pass the time as they wait for Godot. Lucky and Pazzo arrive again, but they are much different. Pazzo has gone blind and must rely on Lucky's guidance and support. He falls down whenever Lucky does, and both fall as they arrive, seemingly unable to get back up. In the climax of the absurd play, when Vladimir and Estragon try to help them, they also fall and cannot get up. Eventually, they help Pazzo up. Pazzo has no memory of any previous meetings with Vladimir and Estragon. In the falling action, a boy arrives with the same message from Godot. He cannot come tonight, but will come tomorrow without fail. The boy says he did not come yesterday, and doesn't know if his brother, who is sick, did either. Night falls, and in the resolution, Vladimir and Estragon agree to go for the night and decide to wait for Godot tomorrow. Neither man moves. There are 4 characters in the theatrical absurdist triumph that is Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Estragon, along with his close companion and frequent partner in bickering, Vladimir, are essentially everymen, representing all of humanity. But the two men also contrast in some ways. Sometimes Vladimir calls Estragon Go-Go. Estragon is primarily concerned with feelings, particularly his own suffering, rather than intellectual thoughts, and he has trouble understanding much of Vladimir's logic and philosophy. He displays intuitive leaps that go deeper than Vladimir does with his logic. If the two primary characters represent two parts of a person, Estragon is the body, possibly represented by his fixation with his boots. The beatings Estragon says he receives represent the suffering that afflicts and traps humanity, though Estragon's complaints about it are self-pitying, and the fear of another beating keeps him locked in the endless waiting that comprises the play's action. Vladimir is the more logical and intellectual of the two primary characters, and he's the only character in the play who remembers most events from one day to another. He works to fit these events into a logical time frame, despite conflicting evidence. And although he tries to explore philosophical ideas logically, he often misses deeper truths that his friend Estragon, who sometimes refers to him as Didi, seems to grasp instinctively. Occasionally searching his hat, which he wears on his, you guessed it, head, he represents the mind, with all its ability to deceive itself, if Estragon represents the body. Pazzo is a wealthy landowner with power and resources, and he sees Vladimir and Estragon as beneath him, but condescends to talk with them anyway. Mostly, he just likes the sound of his own voice. His concern with appearances and social conventions is ridiculous, pointing out their meaninglessness. Pazzo uses his power over his leashed slave Lucky to abuse him, but his power and resources are ultimately useless. They don't give his life meaning or protect him from misfortune, which shows up in the form of his becoming blind. Then, he must rely on Lucky, who was previously merely a convenience and used for entertainment, to help him navigate life, becoming a pitiful character in a single stroke of suddenly changed fate. Lucky, as Pazzo's slave, must constantly carry burdens that are not his own. His body is constrained, much like his free will, as he wears a rope around his neck that Pazzo holds onto like a leash as he whips him. This might be why he seems not even to consider leaving when Pazzo becomes blind, losing most of the power he had wielded over Lucky. But Lucky demonstrates some bizarre willpower during his long speech in Act 1, and he's upset by the prospect of Pazzo selling him, which suggests he may choose to willingly remain in his subservient role. There's a dependency between Lucky and Pazzo that seems related to, but isn't limited to, their inequality. Samuel Beckett famously refused to interpret his absurd, surreal play, Waiting for Godot, letting his writing speak for itself. But this doesn't mean that the play doesn't have key symbols. It does. The leafless tree, Lucky's baggage, and Pazzo's rope. The leafless tree, near which Estragon and Vladimir meet, is completely bare of leaves at the beginning of the play, and represents the only organic element in the setting. And it's dead, or at least dormant. This tree portrays the world as barren and lifeless, emphasizing the lack of purpose and meaning the characters must contend with. The apparent growth of leaves on the tree in Act 2 only adds to the characters' uncertainty about the place and the passage of time. The staging is telling in this regard. Despite Vladimir's description of the tree as covered with leaves, the stage directions explicitly specify only 4 or 5 leaves. Lucky's baggage is a symbol Lucky never puts down, except when it's necessary to fulfill one of Pazzo's orders, after which he immediately picks them up again, even when he has been told not to do so. This action echoes the human tendency of enslavement to burdens, holding on to them even when doing so is totally unnecessary. And the baggage Lucky carries seems to consist mostly of items for Pazzo's comfort. In Act 2, however, one of the bags, which is never opened in Act 1, is revealed to contain only sand. Yet Lucky takes it up again and again, another example of a character deadened by habit, fulfilling the task mindlessly and without real purpose. Pazzo's rope is the only rope that physically appears in the play, and it represents the balance of power in the relationship between Pazzo and Lucky. In Act 1, Pazzo dominates Lucky with a rope half the length of the stage. Pazzo drives Lucky by means of a rope passed around his neck, and Lucky is often the recipient of Pazzo's whip. Yet Lucky accepts, even embraces this balance of power without question, as if he cannot envision any other state for himself. When the rope is shortened in Act 2, the balance of power in Pazzo and Lucky's relationship is less clear. Pazzo, now blind, depends on Lucky for direction, though Lucky still depends psychologically on Pazzo. Also, there are a number of figurative ropes in the play. Vladimir and Estragon, like Pazzo and Lucky, are similarly tied to each other, and tied to Godot and the belief that his arrival will provide a meaning for their lives. Vladimir and Estragon also entertain the idea of hanging themselves with a rope. While suicide is never a real option, its discussion provides the pair a diversion from the act of waiting for Godot. The rope here becomes a symbol of submission to an illogical belief. The main themes in Waiting for Godot, the absurdity of existence, the purposelessness of life, the folly of seeking meaning, and the uncertainty of time, represent larger truths about existence and the human condition. Indeed, one of the most noticeable features of the play is the utter absurdity of existence. Vladimir and Estragon dress shabbily, engage in physically often inept actions, and partake in clownish, nonsensical conversations. They absurdly wait endlessly for an unchanging situation to change when it is clear Godot will never come. Beckett's emphasis on the absurdity of human behavior shows both the tragic and comedic sides of the existential crisis. Though Vladimir and Estragon agree there is nothing to be done, they certainly seem to work frivolously hard to fill the time while they wait. The unavoidable conclusion is that human existence itself is absurd. None of the characters in Waiting for Godot has a meaningful purpose. Purposelessness of life is a key theme, illustrated by the fact that the titular Godot never arrives, rendering the waiting that comprises the entire play meaningless. Likewise, Pazzo and Lucky might seem to be traveling towards something, but their travels are ultimately shown to be equally purposeless. All the characters seem to be trapped in their purposeless roles by little more than habit, which Vladimir calls a great deadener. The idea that life has no purpose is a recurring theme in the theater of the absurd, which Waiting for Godot helped define. Similarly, there's the folly of seeking meaning. It's unclear who or what Godot represents, but by waiting for him, Vladimir and Estragon are seeking some type of meaning outside themselves. Early on, the men remember making a kind of prayer to Godot, expecting it to give them some kind of direction, and they decide it's safer to wait and see what Godot says rather than die by hanging themselves. But Godot never comes, representing the futility and folly of such a search for meaning in an inherently meaningless existence. Finally, there's the uncertainty of time. Time seems to pass normally during the period the characters are on stage, with predictable markers, like the sunset and moonrise, even though the characters are sometimes confused about it. But the intervals between the two acts and various events are wildly uncertain. At the beginning of Act 2, the growth of leaves on the tree suggests a longer period of time has passed than the one day. The characters seem to be trapped by time, endlessly repeating essentially the same day again and again in an absurd, dreamlike way. Time helps people organize their lives and memories. Thus, the uncertainty of time in the play contributes to the feeling of meaninglessness. Duality and hats are the dual motifs in the play Waiting for Godot. Duality is everywhere in Waiting for Godot. Every character has a counterpart that complements and contrasts the other. Vladimir and Estragon seem nearly identical at first, but contrasting characteristics show them to essentially be two different parts of a whole. Pazzo and Lucky are opposite in status, yet share a bizarre mutual dependence. The boy, although written as one part played by a single actor, may actually be two brothers, one of whom tends the sheep, while the other tends the goats. Also, the entire play is dual in structure, consisting of two acts depicting nearly the same events. Act 2 mirrors Act 1, for example. Estragon first arrives in Act 1, while Vladimir is the first to appear in Act 2. It's also clear that the 2 days seen in the play are reflections of many days in the past and days that will continue endlessly. Hats are worn by Vladimir, Estragon, Lucky, and Pazzo, and are a vehicle for the characters to show their identities. Lucky needs his hat in order to think. Pazzo shows his power over Lucky by taking his servant's hat off. Vladimir, the thinker of the two main characters, is fixated on his hat, while Estragon thinks first of his boots. In Act 2, Estragon and Vladimir have a long bit in which they exchange their hats along with Lucky's, an aimless attempt to make time pass as they wait for Godot.